The highest level U.S. delegation in nearly 40 years arrived in Havana yesterday. Talks over migration ended without a solution to one of Cuba's chief concerns. Havana wants to end the U.S. policy that grants Cubans permanent residency after they've been in the U.S. for more than a year.
President Obama shook more than a few trees when he set out recently to normalize relations between America and Cuba. He relit the fires of a long-burning debate about how to free that island nation from the grip of communism. And as 2 days of talks come to an end between the two countries, logic forces one to ask, what's so bad about doing something different? Welcome to Midpoint, professor of government at American University and co-author of the book Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. Professor William LeoGrande joins us again. Professor, good to see you.
Good to be back.
Let's talk about that simple question up front, because we've got people in South Florida who are really angry about this. They remain even angrier now that we have actually sent a delegation there. So let me ask you, that people will say the same thing. What's so bad about changing a policy that hasn't worked in 50 years?
Well, I think it makes sense to at least try something new to see if we can get a better result than we've had. The interesting thing about these recent negotiations, of course, is that they were regularly scheduled. We have a dialogue with Cuba every 6 months to talk about the implementation of the immigration agreement from 1995 and to make sure that that's operating smoothly. What was different about this, of course, is that we added the issue of how we go about normalizing diplomatic relations, and we sent the highest level delegation that we've sent in since 1977.
Now let's talk about that, because specifically there's a lot of people saying that no matter what America does, we can go in, we can smile, we can send the highest ranking officials that we can, but Raul Castro, Fidel, if and when he is still alive, because I think maybe he's like Elvis a little bit at this point. Some people really don't know if he's alive. But to this point, won't make any difference. They will continue to be a communistic country. They will put all the money that we give them in their pockets. None of it will trickle down to the general public and the people on the street. Do you go with that?
Well, no, actually. A lot of the money that is likely to go into Cuba as a result of the changes in policy are actually going to benefit ordinary people. So, for example, if more tourists or travelers on purposeful travel go from the United States to Cuba, they're going to eat in private restaurants. Some of them will stay in private homes rather than in the luxury hotels. They'll leave tips, even if they are staying in the luxury hotels. And all of that money actually goes directly into the pockets of ordinary people and doesn't circulate through the government at all.
But let's not be naive. There's certainly that point that we have to look at as well. This is still a communist regime. These people are still held down in many ways. And the communist regime basically makes sure that most of the money, whether it comes from hotels, airlines, restaurants, whatever, goes into their pocket. How can we be sure that if we do business with the Cuban government, that it will do anything different than what's going on? What's our check procedure here to keep them in line?
Well, I don't think it's so much a matter of keeping them in line as it is trying to reinforce some of the changes that are already started underway in Cuba. A few years ago, after Raul took over from Fidel Castro, he conceded that their economic model wasn't working, that the old Soviet-style model had failed. And he started a process of economic reform modeled after Vietnam and China. So it's still going to be a communist country, but with what they call market socialism. That is to say, a lot freer play for free markets, more of an opening to direct foreign investment and so on. Those are changes, particularly on the economic front, that we ought to welcome, and we ought to design our foreign policy to reinforce those changes and to help push them forward.
45 seconds. We'll take a break, come back and talk more. But before we go, why should we trust Raul Castro? He's been a liar for all these years, and so has Fidel Castro.
Well, it's not a matter of trusting them. As Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. So the Cubans now have made some very specific commitments in these agreements that the two presidents announced on December 17th. And I think we've already been pretty good at holding their feet to the fire on the release of the 53 dissidents that they agreed to release. It took a few days to get that resolved, but in the end, they kept their side of the agreement. So we just have to keep pushing, keep insisting that the Cubans do what they've agreed to do.
All right, now there's a couple of policies that we're going to talk about. If you would, please sit tight. We'll be right back. Short break. We'll return with Professor William LeoGrande. Want to talk a little bit about human rights violations and also some of the other issues that are happening between America and Cuba right now as they seek to start, if you will, some sort of a discourse and at least being able to talk to each other. Later on this hour, telling it like it is, seek some honesty and an apology from one of the biggest race-baiting frauds in American society. Trust me, we and you will not be holding our collective breath. Midpoint continues. Professor William LeoGrande has recently been to Cuba and knows from the ground level about that island nation. We welcome him back to Midpoint now as America and Cuba try to get back together. Let's talk about some of the issues here, if you will, Professor, because America is definitely going to press Cuba on the human rights issue. This has been brought up many times. The Cuban government will fire back and they will say, wait a minute, you have Ferguson, Missouri, you have New York City, you're no better at it than we are. How do we drive this home to the Cuban government, in your opinion, and get them to at least give us some concessions or at least try to make things better for the people there?
Well, these issues have already come up. They came up in the talks in the last 2 days. The U.S. delegation did raise issues of human rights, and as you said, the Cubans turned around and said, well, we think that human rights in the United States have some issues as well. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, and there's not going to be a simple or easy solution to it. If we make demands of the Cubans on the human rights issue, they're just going to ignore them, as they have for the last 50 years. In the same way, if the Cubans suddenly demanded that we let a lot of people out of jail because the Cubans don't think they belong in jail, we wouldn't react too well to that either. I think the way you make progress on the human rights issue is that you have to build a degree of mutual confidence between the two governments so that when we raise these issues, it's not as an adversary raising them, but the Cubans have some self-interest in responding to things that we have concerns about.
Here's the other side of that, though. People are going to say that the Cuban government will always consider us adversaries. They're not going to change that, and they will continue to fall back on that as an excuse as to why they simply won't do things. They'll drag this out as long as possible. They'll pull money out of us. They'll try and make sure that we get airlines and tourists there and do some other things to put money in their pocket, but they will continue to stonewall this, so dealing with them is really a brick wall no matter how you look at it.
Well, I think the Europeans have shown that it is possible to make some headway, not a lot of headway, I admit, but some headway on this issue. A couple of years ago, the Spanish foreign minister, together with the Cuban Catholic Church, was able to negotiate the release of over 120 political prisoners in Cuba. And that's because the Cubans saw the value of improving their relationship with the European Union. They were in it for the economic value of it, but as a result of that, they were willing to do some things on the human rights issue because that was important to the Europeans.
Professor, in your opinion, then, if America wants to move ahead with this, is the U.S. government going to have to end their special privileges for Cuban immigrants, specifically wet foot, dry foot, which is what the Cuban government wants to see wiped out? Will we have to stop doing that?
I don't think we're likely to do that anytime soon. And I don't think that the Cubans are making that a precondition for moving ahead on a variety of other fronts. This is an issue the Cubans have been raising with us for a very long time, really since the wet foot, dry foot policy went into effect back in 1995. It's not going to go away. They'll keep raising it, but I don't think the politics are right yet in this country to change it. The Cuban immigrants do have a special status that no other immigrant in the world has, and as we have a more normal relationship with Cuba, the continuation of that policy may not make a lot of sense, but it's an extraordinarily popular policy in South Florida, and I don't see this administration being willing to try to change it.
There's one other thing that comes up here. We have literally dozens of fraudsters who've been frauding Medicare, credit cards, and so many others. They came to the U.S. from Cuba. They avoid prosecution. They simply go back to the island. If America pushes on this, do you think they'll be able to change this and get these people extradited to the United States? It sounds logical. If the Cubans want money and if they want us, they got to give something sooner or later.
I think there's a real possibility of progress in this area. Over the last couple of years, law enforcement cooperation between the two governments has gradually been improving. Now that the overall relationship is better, I think we're going to see a quickening pace of law enforcement cooperation. It was one of the issues on the agenda of the talks in the last 2 days. And the Cubans have no interest in keeping common criminals who fled to Cuba from the United States. And over the years, they have been willing to return a number of people. So I think there's real opportunity there.
About 45 seconds left. Do you think when the Castros finally die out, there's going to be people sitting there ready to bring Cuba more into the 21st century?
Well, you know, it'll be a new generation of leaders, certainly. The vice president there is only 50 years old, whereas the Castros are in their 80s. And I think, like any generational shift, those people have a different outlook on things. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the country change at a little faster pace than it has in recent years.
Fair to say, though, that the American government still has to make sure they get certain things back from the Cubans and make sure that this all isn't about just handing things over, which is how a lot of people are going to see this no matter what we do. We need to point out once again,
our negotiations should always be aimed at what's in the best interest of the United States.
Exactly. That's very well put, succinctly put. I want to remind everybody that your book is Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. Trust me, it's been going on for a long time, and the book will tell you exactly that. Professor LeoGrande, thanks so much for joining us, my friend. We'll talk to you again.
Very good. See you soon.
Take care. Some see nothing but danger in working with the Cuban government, but in those 90 miles separating America and the island, there is a far greater danger facing the entire planet. It's something we don't see. That's part of the problem. And that is on deck when Midpoint continues, where we question everything.